We're looking at the book of Romans today, and in the book of Romans, Paul starts talking to the Romans, and it's helpful as we went through the book of Acts to peg where in Romans this is. So we know that he writes the book of Romans before he goes to Rome, and he starts his transition into Rome right around the end of chapter 23 when he gets in trouble. He gets in trouble in Jerusalem, gets arrested in Jerusalem, and then he gets sent to Rome because he appeals to Caesar because he's also a Roman citizen. All right, so sometime around or before Acts 22 is when the book of Romans gets written. And it has some very key features in it, like the definition of the gospel in Romans chapter 1, verse 15 through 16. I'm going to preach the gospel to you in Rome also, for it is the power of God unto salvation to them which believe, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. So, and then the content of the gospel is given in 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 4, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. In these chapters, what I want to focus on today is a pivot point in chapter 12. So let me give you a quick overview of kind of how Romans is laid out. In chapters 1 through 3, Paul deals with the concept of sin. Starting at the end of chapter 3, and in chapter 4 and 5, you get the remedy for sin. There's a problem so far, though, because sin has the problem of having lack of glory. And you get the remedy for sin in chapter 4 and 5, but you don't get the remedy for lack of glory in chapter 4 and 5. So if you are reading the book of Romans for the first time with no religious instruction whatsoever, it should bother you by the time you get through chapter 4 and 5, because you saw that we all sin and come short of the glory of God, and then you see a remedy for sin, but you don't see a remedy for glory. All right, you see glory mentioned in chapter 5, but you don't really see the remedy spelled out, okay? And so you should kind of be watching with bated breath. And then in chapter 6 and 7, it's dealing with living with sin, or living with sinfulness, or living with the tendency to sin, and what you should do. So you don't. All right, we'll talk about that in a second. Chapter 8, you finally get your remedy for lack of glory, and that's what salvation is about. Salvation is about the remedy for the lack of glory. It is not, remedy for sin is a necessary precondition for the remedy for the lack of glory, but most people who talk about salvation just talk about the lack of sin, or the need to remedy the sin issue. And they think that once the sin issue is remedied, then you're saved. And that's not true, because you're not glorified. So you need to figure out not only how to deal with the sin, but how to get to glory, okay? Then you have doctrinal stuff in chapters 9, 10, and 11 dealing with Jews, Gentiles, salvation, and some of the future and things like that. And chapter 10 is really the key point. Verses 9 through 10 is where the key points are for how anybody really appropriates salvation in the New Testament age. That thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus, shalt believe in thine heart that God hath raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. For with the heart man believeth unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. That's the key pivot point for appropriation of salvation in the New Testament, okay? And that, notice, happens after Acts 15. And then in chapter 12, there is this dividing line here. And the dividing line is everything in chapters 1 through 11 is kind of theoretical and doctrinal. It'd be like taking a music theory class and he's telling you all the theory, and then we get into practical stuff. Okay, put your hands on the piano and hit this key, that kind of thing. Practical stuff starts in chapter 12, mainly 12, 13, and 14. 15 and 16 is also practical, but it's more specific and has some doctrinal stuff too. Especially in verse 15, we find that Paul is the successor of Jesus Christ as far as the Gentiles are concerned in verses 8 through 16. That's a key passage too. So there's this key pivotal point. So this is practical stuff. And it's common for Paul to have a practical dividing line in his books. For example, in Ephesians, it's right down the middle. There's 6 chapters in Ephesians. The first 3 chapters are about doctrinal stuff and your identity in Christ. Next 3 chapters, all practical stuff. And so you have another dividing line like that here, where you have a bunch of doctrine, 1 through 11. Then it starts getting practical. Here's what I actually physically want you to do. But it's misleading to say it that way. I'm not saying the text is, I'm saying it's misleading for me to say it that way, but I will say that it gets taught that way. And what I want to do today is deal with why that's misleading and why just about, I would say, probably everybody who's talking about Romans chapter 12 verses 1 and 2 is wrong. Or is not as correct as they could, not as helpful as they could be. That's what we want to deal with today. There is some practical stuff in chapter 6, kind of, but it's imperative, but not specific. In other words, he'll say, yield not your members as servants to sin. That's imperative, don't do that. But yield your members as servants to righteousness. Okay, but what does that mean? How do I do that? Well, you don't really get to the how till over here. That makes sense so far? What we're dealing with the chapter in the book of Romans. Now, one of the most memorized passages, well, Romans has a lot of memorized passages in it. If you've ever done any evangelism, you probably heard of something called the Romans Road. And since Romans is about the gospel, the whole concept of the gospel, you can kind of do a Cliff's Notes version of the book of Romans and reduce it down to something called the Romans Road. If you're trying to evangelize somebody, you can tell them how to be saved. You can hit some highlight key points, and then you basically take them through, land them in chapter 10, 9, and 10 is how to appropriate your salvation. If you're giving like what you might call an extended version of an elevator speech about what the gospel is. So Romans chapter 12, verse 1 and 2, as far as people who are already saved, might be one of the most memorized passages in the book of Romans, the most taught passages in the book of Romans, Romans chapter 12, verse 1 and 2. And today, I'm going to be so bold as to say I'm going to give you information on Romans 12:2 that you've never heard before and that I don't think has ever been taught before. And could come across as heretical. And if that's the case, that's good. It could come across as insulting. Romans chapter 12, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. Some people think they present themselves to God, that they're going above and beyond, but according to the Bible, that's reasonable. And be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. And what I want to do today is talk about this transformation. This transformation. What usually happens when you talk about a transformation is Christians teach that the transformation by the renewing of your mind comes through adding Christian information to your brain. Okay? And so I'm going to put the word wrong out here. And the word wrong is to add information. And basically the concept is if I take all the propositions in my tenets of faith, somebody got upset with the word tenets of faith, because they're like, tenets are in an apartment building, but I think we all understand what tenets of faith are. If I take all my tenets of faith, like my statement of faith at my church, and I add it all up and I try to teach that to people, that is a list of propositions, and I am just adding things to what people know. I'm just adding to what they know. And that's a problem. The transformation that has to take place, there's a developmental psychologist, Piaget, and he talked about a transformation in what you're looking at is, this is how this usually gets taught is quantitative. In other words, I'm just going to add an amount of information into your head, and that's going to constitute your transformation. If you learn all these things, we'll consider you transformed. And then once you can repeat them back with fidelity, then we'll start putting you in charge. You can be the Sunday school teacher and the deacon and the pastor and the bishop and the elder and the president of the denomination and the professor and all that kind of stuff. But there comes a transformation where there's a qualitative difference. And a qualitative difference is not just a change in the amount of information that you can know, but in the type of information that you can know. What's your ability to learn, the kinds of things that you can learn, okay? And this could come through cognitive stuff and like insights. Let me give you an example of an insight. I'm going to tell you a riddle. Now you guys got to guess the riddle. Somebody just recently told me this riddle online, and this is a great example of this kind of qualitative change in the way of thinking. The question at the end of what I'm going to tell you is, what color is the bear? A guy goes bear hunting, and I'm going to ask you what color the bear is, okay? So a guy goes bear hunting. He leaves his cabin. He walks 1 mile directly south. He walks 1 mile directly west. He encounters a bear, kills the bear, and then, prepares the meat and all that kind of stuff and packs it up. And then he walks 1 mile directly north back to his cabin. What color is the bear?
White. I've heard it before.
Yes.
I didn't hear the answer, but yeah. Polar bear. It's the only way you get back to his house at the North Pole.
Yeah, so if you go directly south and then you go directly west and then you go directly north, that doesn't work. So you have an insight. I probably spelled that wrong. You have an insight, and your insight is a combination of a few things. You have basic arithmetic, you have numeracy, you have cardinal directions, and you understand something about spherical trigonometry. And so you have a combination of all those things enabled you to come up with what color. Now imagine telling that to a flat earther. Okay, they're not going to be able to answer the question. Especially if not just a flat earther from today who would be able to deduct that you're speaking of a spherical earth, but a flat earther of somebody who had no concept of a spherical earth. So if you think about the different kinds, you have, because of your familiarity with basic trigonometry and spherical trigonometry, basic stuff, you're able to deduct that kind. So what we're kind of talking about is a qualitative change in the kinds of things that you can know. A flat earther from 950 AD would not be able to deduct the color of the bear with that information. But you can, because you have insights that they don't have. Does that make sense? So what we want to do is to transform not into a person who just has a bunch of things added, a quantity of things added to what they know, but a qualitative change in the kinds of things that they can know. That's the word transformation, the word metamorphosis there. Now, a qualitative change in the kinds of things that you can know. Imagine you're in math class, you're in the 4th grade, and you're memorizing your multiplication tables, okay? Now, if you just add to your multiplication tables, I think most kids learn their multiplication tables up through the 12s, right? And then maybe you could add, up through 15. Maybe you could add up to 20, but you're still doing the same kind of thing. You're just adding what you memorized, and you're just spitting it out like a computer. And maybe you could even get technical and say, well, I'm going to memorize all the decimals to the 10th place. and memorize those multiplication tables. Well, really, you're still doing the same thing. You're just adding information. There's no qualitative change. Well, if you take multiplication, your ability to multiply, and then you go into, say, algebra or geometry or trigonometry or calculus, now you have a qualitative transformation. You're not just adding the amount of things, you are changing quality of what you're doing, okay? Now, here's the big thing that I'm going to say about Romans 12, which will probably get me fired from YouTube, from my YouTube audience. The information that's contained in the New Testament. Some people have counted about 1,116 commands in the New Testament, from Christ and the apostles, Paul, that kind of thing. I got something happened in my nose here. Some people's concept of Christianity is to where you need to obey all the commands found in the New Testament. Now, you think the Old Testament's bad? There's only 613 mitzvot commandments in the Old Testament. All those laws, only 613 of those. If you add up everything you're told that's an imperative in the New Testament, or that's you get 1,116 of them. And some people's concept is that if I'm a good Christian, I will correctly apply all 1,116 things. That's some people's concept. I don't think that's it at all. I think that what we are being told is pre-transformational instructions. Instructions. And that's key. Pre-transformational instructions. In other words, you have a transformation that's coming, and Paul, who's writing in sometime around maybe 60 AD or so, he has no idea what you might encounter in Louisiana in 2020. He has no idea. But he does know that you can transform into the kind of being that can do the right thing in that environment. While you're waiting for that transformation, I can give you some basic guidelines. So let me say this. Let me give you a couple of examples of this transformation. Let's say, let's look at stem cells. Stem cells are all going to become something else, right? They start off as not really having a purpose, and then eventually they get assigned a purpose and they become something else. They become a liver cell or a skin cell. They become something. They change, they transform into something else. They get qualitatively transformed. They don't just do more of what they were doing before, they start doing something different. They gain a new ability. And not only do they gain a new ability, but they also narrow their potential. Because you know when a child's born, he has a whole world in front of him, and he could be anything. Well, when he becomes an adult, he's not going to be anything. He can be something. He's going to be a planner or a military officer. He's going to be something, a thing. He's not going to be what is, so you kind of narrow. You need to transform into that. I try to come up with different illustrations for this kind of transformation. But imagine everybody's sitting in a waiting room. And in a waiting room, you're going to go back to see the doctor, right? And when you see the doctor, you're going to get some news and everything's going to change. Well, in the waiting room, imagine there's rules for how to behave in the waiting room. And then imagine you're studying medicine, like American medicine from the outside, and the only thing you get exposed to is what goes on in the waiting room. And you think that's American medicine. And so what I compare, all the instruction in Romans chapter 12 through 16 really, is waiting room instructions. How to sit in the chair and be quiet. It's pre-transformational instruction. It's like, I can't tell 1.2 billion people everything they're going to be to fulfill the will of God. But I can say, as you're waiting for your transformation, here are some basic guidelines. Sit still, be nice, follow the rules, do what's right, don't kick each other. You know what I'm saying? That kind of thing. Now, when you transform, you're going to transform into something for which there are no rules. Now, let me give you an example of that. Now, Chris, you probably know this example better than I do. But we basically follow rules like we don't hit each other, right? It's like a 3-year-old rule, a 2-year-old rule. You don't hit people. But we're all military people here, which means we all know there comes a time when you have to break that rule, right? And so we have these big philosophical discourses on what constitutes a justified war. So we do know that there is a time when you break that rule, and it's the right thing to do to break the rule. What we want to do is transform into the kind of person that knows when to break the rule. Well, you know, I don't want to fight anybody, but if I have to defend myself or if I have to defend my family, I will. I will physically fight them, melee, or I will bust out my guns and shoot if I have to until I can stop whoever's doing whatever that they needed to stop doing. And the example that I've used before is like cutting off somebody's leg. We all basically follow the rules of not cutting off people's legs when we come to work. We socialize, all kind of stuff, but there comes a time when you may have to do that to save somebody's life, right? And so that's the kind of thing that I'm getting into, to where you are transforming into a kind of being that you can step away from the waiting room rules because you have a higher purpose. Whatever you're supposed to do in the waiting room is not what you're supposed to do once you get called to the back, okay? And when you undergo this transformation, you're going to change in ways that neither you or I know. And it's going to be selective. Like when you go in the military, everyone's in basic training, you're all kind of Joe Schmoes, you're all kind of together, and then you get your MOS assignment, and then you go to become something else. You kind of go through a separation thing. And that's kind of like new Christians. You all sign up together, and then everyone's going to get a different MOS assigned to them, and they're going to be transformed into that. Now, you're going to have different rules. So if I'm a stem cell and I'm becoming a liver cell, and there's another stem cell that's becoming an eyeball cell, he can't look at the other cell over there and say, hey, you're doing the wrong thing. You're supposed to come up here with these optic nerves and hang out up here. If you kind of thumb through Romans 12, you'll get in the middle of keep thumbing through. Chapter 13 is about really dealing with the government. And then chapter 14 is dealing with other people. And there's this key verse in verse 13 in chapter 14, Romans chapter 14. And look at verse 10. But why dost thou judge thy brother, or why dost thou set it not thy brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. For it is written, as I live, saith the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. So then every one of us shall give account of himself to God. Let us not therefore judge one another any more, but judge this rather, that no man put a stumbling block or an occasion to fall in his brother's way. Now, if you extrapolate that out, it's kind of like everybody's going to become a different MOS, and you can't take what's right for you and put it onto somebody else because they're not transforming into what you're transforming into. So we're going from an Old Testament mindset of following the law. We're not following the law anymore because we're not a single country with borders, language, and culture where we can all follow the same law and be a peculiar people in that sense. We have to be a peculiar people in another sense. And the law we're following now is a spiritual law, and what that is we talked about in our first few sessions, where we have an aim. And we're headed for that aim. And whatever the best aim you can conceptualize, that is what you're transforming into. And as you aim for that, you are going to have to make decisions. You're going to have decision points along the way, like a poem. You're going to have milestones that you hit, and you're going to have to make decisions along the way. And there is no rule book that can tell you what decisions to make. but you have to transform into the kind of person who can make the right decisions as you're moving closer to this aim. Now, furthermore, when you start getting your own stuff squared away, like Jordan Peterson says, clean your room, you start small, you start with your own area, and then you start to circumambulate out to where you positively affect more areas of your life. And if you do that well, you can get to the point where you can start positively affecting other people's lives. So there's another person next to you, and they are headed toward an aim, and their aim is different than yours, okay? But you can, the transformation is not about a list of things that you know. It's about being something new. Now I want to take that word being, we talked about that before when we talked about our 4-quadrant thing. We talked about meaning, connectedness to others, to God, to base reality, and to an aim, okay? Now when you transform into that new kind of being, I want you to see the words being and love as connected. God is love, right? 1 John 4:8. And the word Jehovah means existing one. Jehovah said to Moses, I am that I am. That's a be verb, I am. That's I exist. Jehovah means existing one. If you're being, you want to make your own being as good as possible, not only for yourself, but as beneficial to others as possible. Now, out of love, you are willing to help aid and facilitate the transformation of somebody else into being something better than what they are. Qualitative. I said qualitation on there. Qualitatively being something better. Now the reason love is so important there is because that transformation into this thing that you conceptualize is going to include some of the toughest battles you can conceive and some of the toughest battles you cannot conceive. And you're going to go through those. Every Christian is going to, if they're transformed, they're going to go through those transformational battles to where literally it's do or die. If you don't make it through this transformation, you are not going to make it. You're going to hit rock bottom. Something bad is going to happen. And to love somebody is to be willing to go through that fight with them. And that's a tall order because their struggle could kill you. That's why you take heed when your brother stumbles, lest you be overcoming a fault too. So that transformation is a very difficult thing, and if you can ever get to the point where you're helping other people go through their transformation, that is a very loving thing. So people will accuse me of being existentialist when I say this, and maybe so, but existentialism, the negative part of that is people associate it with materialism and with nihilism, and that's not the kind of existentialism I would be talking about. Mine would be a little more like Viktor Frankl, where being is connected with meaning, and meaning is connectedness with other entities, other people, God, base reality, and your aim. And your connectedness with other people helps transform them into something that is qualitatively better than what they were before. That's love. So being, you're transforming. Now, the Christian life, we were talking a few minutes ago about why people become atheists. One of the things I think it is because to outsiders, Christianity looks like a list of garbage that you are supposed to quantitatively learn. They see Christianity as a behavior and a set of explanations. That's all it is to them. There is no transformation. But Epictetus said, I think he said, don't tell me what you know, show me how you're transforming. Now, if we could show people how we're transforming, we wouldn't have to tell them anything. I believe that. I mean, I think part of transforming has to do with speaking. I mean, you're going to tell people stuff because you have to speak the logo. The logos has to flow through you, has to be manifested through you. You have to articulate the logos. Are we tracking so far? We're going to get into this. I don't even know if I need to take a picture of this because it should be on the video, but maybe it'll be helpful. I want to make slides of this afterwards. As we're looking at Romans chapter 12, verse 2, so an insight that helps you transform. An insight is a rapid increase in cognitive fluency. And your mind can operate off certain psychotechnologies that help it work better. Some of the most common psychotechnologies we have are speech, literacy, and numeracy, right? And then you have psychotechnologies that are mental, embodied, and pharmacological. A mental psychotechnology would be like speech, literacy, numeracy, Cartesian graphing, for example, mathematics, mental, and maybe even meditation and prayer and things that prepare your mind and putting information in your mind too. Embodied psychotechnologies can be things like dopamine deprivation to help you concentrate better. So you have a difficult time concentrating at work because you keep wanting to look at your phone, because every time you look at your phone you get a dopamine hit and it makes you feel a little bit better, okay? Well, that dopamine hit is keeping you from doing things that are better, so you might go through the psychotechnology of you take one day a week where you never look at your phone to get you used to that idea, and then you can concentrate better as a result, okay? And then you have, does that make sense? You know, and then yoga, martial arts, there's things like that go into embodied stuff, and then there's pharmacological stuff. And that could be anything from caffeine to DMT, okay? And you can go take stuff like focus factor and take things that actually help you think better, okay? So psychotechnologies are things that we can kind of put into our mind to help us have better cognition. Bearing that in mind, let's look at some of the 15 minutes. Look at chapter 12, verse 2 again. Romans 12, 2. And be not conformed to this world. Now that word conformed comes from a Greek word which is systematizo. All right. Now, this sy comes from sin, and that means union with. And right here, if you're in plans, that's where we get our word schematic from. Okay. So in union with the schematic of the world. And be not. That's what it's saying. And be in conform with the form, with the shape of. Be not with the shape of the world. Be not in union with the schematic of the world. The world tells you to be a certain way, to put yourself together in a certain way. Don't be that, is what the confirmation there is. And then the world, your surrounding environment. But be ye transformed. Now that word transformed, exformed, is metamorphosis. And we have examples of metamorphosis, and the Greek word is a real close cognate to that, like metamorpho or something like that. So we bullfrogs and butterflies, I think, is a song we used to teach kids. You know, you got tadpoles turning into a frog, and you got worms turning into butterflies, and they undergo this transformational process. And I would think maybe a butterfly is a better example of what you and I have to go through because of the cocoon phase. When you undergo a transformation, there is something, the most archetypal one you can think of is the crucifixion of Christ, and then going and being buried, okay, and then coming back out alive. So when you undergo a transformation in your life, it's going to be like that, but not as bad, because you're not going to physically die, but it'll be bad. And so there's going to be a metamorphosis, and that's like the cocoon phase of a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. And then transformed by the renewing of your mind. Now this is kind of an interesting word here. The Greek word for renewing, anakainosis. And then, so ana, like Anabaptist, to do again, or again, you might say. And then kai is a bonding word. It usually gets translated into the word and. It could be with, but it's like stronger than the word and. So again, with gnosis, if you put a G right there, it's knowledge, okay? Again, with knowledge.
In this video here, I actually make an error because I'm going from memory. The word gnosis, or the sound of gnosis on the end of anakainosis, does not come from the word gnosis, but rather comes from kainos, and that kainos actually means new. So anakainos, anakainosis, the kainos part means new. So anakainosis is again and new is really what that means, not again and knowledge. But I was going from memory and I made a mistake here, so I wanted to clear that up for those of you going forward. I recorded this part after the fact.
All right, it's really what anakainosis means, renewing. The renewing is redoing the knowledge structure of your head, really, is kind of what that is. The renewing of your mind. Now that word mind it comes out, the cognate, the transliteration would be like the word nous, and if you look it up in the lexicon, it'll say probably from Gnostikos.
There's another error here from going from memory. The intent was not to say Gnostico or Gnostikos, but what the intent was to say Gnosko. So that's the error of going from memory. And on the previous error, I conflated Gnosko from the word mind, or nous, with anakainosis in my memory. So gnosko is the proper word here.
Which this part of the word gnostikos, which is a Greek word for knowledge. Okay? So by redoing the knowledge structure schematic of your knower, in other words, of that which knows about you. So knowing, there's something about knowing that's very, very strong in this what we're looking at here. That ye may prove, now there we go. Prove. So y'all have Blue Letter Bible? I'm gonna go to Blue Letter Bible, and I'm gonna go to bring up so what I'm looking at here, if you can't see this, is I'm looking at an interlinear concordance. So where I have all the English words, Romans 12:2, and then I have the Greek words over here. And this is very interesting. Dokimazo is the word for prove. And the word for prove, to test, examine, prove, scrutinize, to see whether a thing is genuine or not as metals, to recognize as genuine after examination, to approve, to deem worthy. And in Strong's definition, there's a word in here I really want to hone in on. Mazo, to test literally or figuratively by implication, to approve, to allow, to discern. Discern. Well, that's a good one. To discern and to examine. So that you may... All right, so let's go to Hebrews chapter 5. Let's look at discernment. Hebrews chapter 5. If you look in verse 10, he starts talking about this guy named Melchizedek. Well, he's been talking about him a lot. He starts talking about Melchizedek. He says in verse 11, well, we got a lot of things to say about Melchizedek, but it's hard for me to say them because you guys are dull of hearing. For when the time you ought to be teachers, you have need that one teach you again, which be the first principles of the oracles of God. You need to take you back to the waiting room. Stem cell stuff. And are become such as had need of milk and not of strong meat. For everyone that useth milk is unskillful in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But strong meat belongeth to them that are full age, even those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. So that word discernment, you take the word prove, what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. And that's to really demonstrate, but the way you do that is I'm connecting it because of its definition to discernment. And that is something that has to be used and exercised. That is experiential. It's something you do. It's not something you know, it's something you do. So as you're heading for your aim, whatever your goal is up here, you're going to encounter decision points like we talked about a few minutes ago. And your job as a Christian is at each one of these decision points is to discern each way. Here's the good, here's the bad. Here's what I should do in this scenario. Do I cut off the leg or not? Do I get in a fight or not? What do I do here? Do I help this person transform? Or am I casting my pearls before swine? So you're going to make all these decisions to do this, and the transformed person is the one who transforms into the person who can do the discernment. And it's like a muscle. It has to be exercised. It has to be used. It has to be worked out. It's not just a list of things that you can learn. It has to be, it's experiential. Now, I will say this. If the New Testament Christianity was just about following these 116 things that we're told to do in the New Testament, this verse would not exist. We would not have to prove or demonstrate what the good, acceptable, perfect will of God is, because it would just be delivered to us and we could just follow it like a list. But the reason that doesn't exist is because we have to transform into the person who can prove through discernment what that perfect will of God is. Does that make sense? You following? No, I got to get people out of the waiting room. I got to get people out of being stem cells. Think of a transformation. Let's do a cognitive exercise that might jolt you a little bit. Suppose somebody comes up to you and they said, hey, look, I have a way, a magic potion or whatever, I have a way that will transform you into a vampire. Would you like to do that? Yes or no? Now think about that. There's things about being, we talked about being and love, right? There's things about being that you can't possibly know until you transform into a vampire. What's it like to be immortal? What's it like to want to drink blood? Will your values change? Will you have to sleep in a casket? You know, there's all kinds of things that will be different that you have to think about that really you cannot know until you make the transformation. Now, Paul is just one guy, which means in all the military of God's army, he only has one MOS. He cannot possibly know everybody's MOS, what the philosophers use as qualia. And qualia is what you can know is for your own perspective. Now, in the Bible, that shows up in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, what man knoweth the things of man, save the spirit of man which is in him. Now, the only reason you can kind of put yourself in Chris's shoes, because he's a human, you're a human, and you can I can imagine myself in that situation. And you can do that with any other person because you also are a person. You start try to do that with a dog or a buffalo, and it gets a little more difficult, okay? But you have a qualia that only you know. And when you transform, your qualia of experience will be so different. It would be like a cat trying to imagine what it's like to be you. It's that different. Well, maybe not that different, but it's pretty different. So your qualia is going to change. So you ask a question, we do this all the time. I want you to undergo a transformation. You'll never be the same after this. You're not going to be a vampire, but maybe you're going to have a child, right? You have a child. That's, if you've ever had a child, you know that there is no list of things that you can know or tell somebody that prepares somebody for that transformation. And they will transform in a way that will be unique to that scenario. And there's no way you can really prepare them for it. Get married. There's no way you can prepare somebody for what's going to happen. Should I... I just erased now, didn't I? Should I get in this relationship or not? Should I take this job or not? Anytime you make a decision like that, it changes your qualia to some degree. What your experience of the world is. And you need to transform into something that no book can possibly spell out everything you're going to do as the transformed person. The Bible only has 788,257 words in it. There's no way that it can account for everything that every person might do. All right? So of the knowing, we looked at the mind, the renewing of the mind, and there are 4 types of knowing. And I'm going to cover this in 2.5 minutes. We started a little late, didn't we? First kind of knowing is propositional knowing. And the normative feature, the normative function in propositional knowing is conviction of truth. That is your statement of faith at your church, okay? The list of doctrines you're supposed to believe that are correct, okay? That's propositional knowing. Second kind is procedural knowing. And the normative feature, the normativity of procedural knowing is ability or power. You say, what are you talking about? You can know, like, how do you catch a baseball? That's procedural knowing. Now my fiance and I, we play volleyball. And probably the best volleyball player in the world might not take a best written test of volleyball. So imagine somebody who's very smart, they can take a written test and tell you how to play baseball, right? Does that mean they can get out there and play with the Yankees or the Dodgers? Absolutely not. There's something about procedural knowing that cannot be transmitted semantically. It's just something you know how to do. Now we're getting somewhere with our transformation. You have perspectival. Knowing, and that is where the qualia comes in that I just talked about, and that is the 1 Corinthians chapter 2, what man knoweth the things of man, save the spirit of man which is in him. And that is a present thing, and the normativity is whether or not you have an optimal grip on a scenario or situation. Now, some of this information comes from cognitive psychologist John Vervaeke, so I don't want to not credit the psychological source of some of these, what science tells us about knowing, okay? You have participatory knowing. Participatory knowing. And the normativity of participatory knowing is attunement with your agency and arena relationship. So your agency and arena, well, imagine you're a football player and the arena is the football field. And your agency is to play football. That's your agency. That's a very easily understood agency and arena relationship. And then your broader arena would be like how to be a professional football player in this culture. Like you should probably go get endorsements and make sure you're doing your workouts and have some kind of mentorship. Get somebody that has a deal, what do they call it, a agent that can make deals for you. And maybe go do some community service things. There's all kinds of things connected with that, and that's the broader agency and arena. And somebody who is highly attuned to their agency and arena relationship is like, say you have like a congressman who really knows how to get a bill passed through. Okay, that's kind of a process that if those, like we know that what has to happen, but we've never done that. We don't know how to do it. If I were to stick you in Congress today, you'd have to kind of orient yourself probably for a couple of weeks before you figure out what's going on. Well, somebody who is highly attuned to that agency arena complex would know how to do that. Okay? So, as you're transforming as a Christian, here's what happens. You need to become this with regard to your post-transformational Christianity. When you're finished being a stem cell, when you leave the waiting room, it's time to become a vampire, okay? It's time to get your MOS. This is what you should be. Now, modern Christianity, here's the problem with how Romans 12:2 gets taught and what gets left out. Modern Christianity is all this right here. That's it. It's just propositional claims on truth. I'm going to make a willful assertion of a creedal proposition. Bam. I believe X, Y, Z. And you see the statement of faith at your church says, we believe da 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 da. And that's a propositional truth is to say, I know that something. Like I know that a cat is a mammal. Right? What do I do with that? Okay, if I can quantify that, and I can know that a dog is a mammal. I can know that an oak tree is not an animal. I can know things, and I can add to the quantity of things that I know that are propositional truths that aren't necessarily wrong, but that's not that's not a qualitative change in the types of things that I can know. And the only way to get a qualitative change in the types of things that you can know is through experience, procedural. You have to be able to do something, exercise discernment, your perspective, and your participatory attunement with your surroundings. Now this, in my opinion, is what Christianity should be about. Not to leave this out, but there's so much of an emphasis on propositional truth. And if you go to the East, in Hinduism and Buddhism, you basically have no propositional truth, and it's probably all number 4. It's all the Zen, being attuned to your, being flow with the way and the Tao and all that kind of stuff. And then, so there needs to be a balance. And if your aim as a Christian, and we got to quit, is a few weeks ago we talked about Ephesians 4 and how the body of Christ starts off in its nascent form, and it's got pastors and teachers and evangelists, and it's supposed to transform into something to where every joint supplieth edification to every other joint. Your job is to transform into that, something that can provide edification to others, that can build people into what they're supposed to transform into, including all this. In a scenario, and operate in a scenario where 1 John 2:27 is a reality, where it says, "Ye need not that any man teach you." How do you get there? And the reason you don't need any man to teach you is because there's no list of propositions that any person can give you that constitutes what your transformational qualia will be once it's complete. That's impossible for me to give to you. That's impossible for anybody to give to you. And for any Christian to think that a pastor or a seminary or a church or any kind of educational program, or even me standing here talking to you, is going to be able to provide that transformation by giving you facts you can memorize, that's an error in the way of thinking. There has to be a transformation in your mode of being, a qualitative transformation in the person. And I think that is what Christianity should be about, not just propositional, dogmatic, creedal, willful assertions of what people think is truth that can't even be verified in many cases. All right, I think I'm going to stop talking now. I see you winking at me there. Are we, anybody got any comments or anything?
So what are we discussing next week?
So I thought next week we could discuss this.
Send me that last picture you took. I think I got a way to visually portray that.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I want. So, insights. Okay, if I were
You send me that one too, please.
if I were to add something, I would say that Christian education, what we should be doing is, instead of broadcasting information that people should memorize and test whether or not they can feed it back with fidelity, we should be doing something that cultivates insight. So in other words, you have insights in your head that can help me. And I have to find a way to disabuse you of your ideological possession so that insight can come out. An ideological paradigmatic possession of lists of things that we're supposed to know is like a shield that blocks people from having their own sense making and producing their own insight, which comes out to help edify other people in their transformational process. Yeah, so perhaps next week, and I'll try to get this online as soon as possible. I have another video that I just recorded that I'm trying to get online too, so I'll try to get those on this week, and then I'll send you guys a text when it comes out. And then next week, if we could just chat. Any last words before we quit?
If you have any leading questions for next week, that would be helpful.
Leading questions?
Yes.
My big question right now is how, for myself, I don't feel qualified to talk about a transformation that I'm not sure I'm embodying. Number one. And number two, I know that the American church is dead because of its focus on this without any of this. Without there is no Romans 12:2 transformation taking place in American Christians, and that's why American Christianity is dead. So how do we get from that to the Ephesians 4 model? That's what I would like to see, if we can cultivate some insight on how, as a church, we change how we do business so that we're cultivating insight and the transformation rather than just going through rituals and putting out mimetic information. That's like the premise. So that's what I'd like to learn myself. And I'm thinking maybe if we put more heads together, we can come up with some insights for how would we do that.